It had been the longest 30 days of Maya's life. Each moment, each hour, stretched endlessly as she sat by her son's side in the hospital, watching him lying there, motionless. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, and the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the only sound that provided some semblance of normalcy. Her son, Zane, had been in a coma since the accident, an accident that no one had seen coming. Just a normal Saturday afternoon, a bike ride through the park, a few moments of laughter, and then the crash. Everything had changed in an instant. One minute, Zane had been fine, full of life and energy. The next, he was lying unconscious in a hospital bed, connected to tubes and machines that kept his fragile body alive. For the first week, Maya had held on to hope. The doctors said that some comas lasted longer than others, that the brain just needed time to heal. They told her to be patient, to wait. But after the second week, after the third, the weight of the reality started to sink in. Zane hadn't moved, not once. The doctors were kind, but their words had grown softer, quieter. They weren't saying it outright, but the uncertainty was there in their eyes. Maya, sometimes the brain takes longer to heal. We're doing everything we can, but you need to prepare yourself. Those words repeated in her mind every night, haunting her in the silence of the hospital room. She stayed beside him, refusing to leave. She talked to him, told him stories about the things he loved, about the future he still had ahead of him. But there was no response, no flicker of recognition in his still form. Her friends and family told her to rest, that she needed to take care of herself, but how could she? How could she rest when her son, her beautiful boy, was fighting for his life? She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The only thing that kept her grounded was the promise she had made to Zane when he was just a little boy. She would never leave him. It was the 30th day, exactly 1 month, when Maya got the call. She had just finished wiping away the tears that had been flowing steadily for hours. The exhaustion, the grief, the constant waiting had worn her down. As she sat in the sterile room, her phone rang. At first, she didn't recognize the number, but when she picked it up, her breath hitched as she heard the voice on the other end. Maya, it's the hospital. Zane, he's awake. For a split second, her mind went blank. Awake? How was that possible? She had heard the doctor's words, felt the chill of their warnings. But now this, the one thing she had been praying for, the one thing she had not dared to believe could happen. Zane was awake. Tears flooded her eyes again. But this time, they were different. These tears were filled with a sense of hope, of disbelief. Maya jumped to her feet, her heart racing. She had to see him. Maya's heart was pounding in her chest as she hurried down the hospital hall, each step feeling heavier than the last. The phone call had been brief, but it had left her with a whirlwind of emotions: shock, disbelief, hope, and a tinge of fear. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. Zane was awake. It was the last thing she expected to happen after a month of silence. She reached Zane's room, the door slightly ajar. With a trembling hand, she pushed it open, and there he was. Her son, lying in the same bed where he had been for a month. But this time, there was a difference. His eyes were open. For a moment, Maya stood frozen in the doorway, staring at him as if she was dreaming. He was awake, but it didn't seem real. His face, pale and worn, was still framed by the mess of his disheveled hair. The machines were still hooked up to him, the beeping of the heart monitor steady and constant. But now the room was filled with a new energy, an energy that had been absent for weeks. Zane, Maya whispered, her voice breaking. Zane blinked slowly, his eyes focusing on her. His gaze was dazed at first, almost confused. Then, as if a cloud lifted from his mind, his lips curled into a faint, weak smile. Mom? His voice was hoarse, strained, but it was his voice. Maya felt a rush of emotions flood over her: relief, joy, disbelief. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she sank to the side of the bed, taking his hand in hers, gripping it tightly. He was here. He was back. Zane, you're awake. You're really awake, she exclaimed, her voice thick with emotion. She couldn't stop the tears from streaming down her face now. This moment, this miracle, was everything she had prayed for. The doctors had told her to prepare for the worst, But here he was, alive and looking at her with recognition in his eyes. Zane's smile faded as he tried to sit up, wincing in pain. His body, though awake, was clearly weak. "What happened?" he asked, his voice quiet. "I don't remember." Maya took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wiped her tears, trying to put her emotions aside to focus on him. "You were in an accident, Zane. You've been in a coma for a month." Zane blinked, the confusion in his eyes deepening. He tried to speak, but his voice faltered. "A month?" His hand reached up to his head as if trying to grasp the reality of the situation. "I don't remember." Maya's heart ached. How could he remember? He'd been unconscious for so long. The doctors had warned her that the amnesia might be a side effect of the trauma, that it could take time for his memory to come back. But she didn't care. The important thing was that he was here, that he was talking to her. "It's okay, baby. We'll take it one day at a time. You're here now. That's all that matters." Maya's voice softened as she stroked his hair, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to fully breathe. The doctors hadn't given her much hope, but Zane had defied all odds. There was so much to process, so much that was unknown. But in this moment, Maya was just grateful for this precious gift. Zane looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and fear. "Will I be okay, Mom?" His voice was small, vulnerable, the way it used to be when he was younger. Maya hesitated for a moment, looking into his eyes, seeing the boy she had always known. She didn't know the full extent of his recovery. There were still many tests to be done, still many unknowns. But she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let him face this alone. "Yes, Zane, you're going to be okay. We're going to get through this together." She squeezed his hand tighter, her resolve stronger than ever. She didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt hope stirring in her chest. The days following Zane's awakening were a whirlwind of doctors, tests, and recovery. Maya sat by his side every moment she could, talking to him about everything and nothing, anything that could bring back the connection they had. Zane's memory was a puzzle, pieces of it scattered and disjointed. The doctors reassured her that it was normal after such a traumatic event, but that didn't make the process any easier for either of them. Zane would remember snippets, his favorite cartoons, the smell of his mother's cooking, a distant memory of playing with his friends at school. But the accident, the days leading up to it, were shrouded in a fog. It was like his mind was trying to protect him, keeping the trauma locked away. Maya could see it in his eyes when he tried to recall things. He wanted to remember, wanted to understand, but he couldn't. And Maya? She was living in a delicate balance between hope and fear. She was grateful, so unbelievably grateful that her son had woken up. But with every little memory Zane reclaimed, she feared the next, larger one. What if the memory of the accident, the horror of what had happened, came flooding back? What if it was too much for him to bear? Zane's strength surprised her every day. Despite the fog that clouded his mind, he was eager to get back to normal. He started asking questions, trying to relearn how to walk, how to do the things he used to do with ease. It wasn't easy, though. Every step was a struggle, every word was a challenge. The doctors had told Maya it would take time, that recovery was more than physical, it was mental, emotional. It would be a journey, one that neither of them could walk alone. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling therapy session, Zane was sitting by the window, his eyes distant as he stared outside. Maya could tell he was frustrated, a knot of anxiety twisting in her chest. How long would it take? Would he ever be the same? "Mom, do you think I'll ever be able to play basketball again?" Zane asked suddenly, his voice small. The question took Maya by surprise. Basketball. It had been his favorite sport, the one thing he never seemed to tire of. But seeing him sitting there, frail and uncertain, made her heart ache. "Of course, sweetheart." Maya's voice was steady, even though she wasn't entirely sure herself. "It's just going to take time, that's all. You're strong. You'll get there." Zane's gaze remained fixed on the window, but his fingers curled around the edge of his blanket, a silent sign of his unease. He didn't say anything more about basketball, but Maya could see it in his eyes. the longing, the desire to get back to who he was before. It was all he wanted. To return to the world that was familiar, where he could play, laugh, and be the active, carefree child he once was. Maya sat down beside him, placing her hand gently on his shoulder. I know it's frustrating, Zane, but we'll take it one day at a time. Together. Zane turned to her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I want to be like I was before. I want to feel like myself again. Maya's heart squeezed as she looked into his eyes. There was so much pain in those words. She knew he wasn't just talking about basketball. He wanted to feel like himself again. Before the accident, before all of this. You will, baby, you will. Her voice was thick with emotion. She kissed his forehead, brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. But even as she said the words, Maya knew it wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be immediate. It wasn't just about healing Zane's body. It was about healing his spirit. The accident had changed him in ways no one could fully understand. As the days passed, Zane continued his recovery. The physical therapy, the cognitive exercises, the long hours of trying to push through pain and frustration. It was a slow process, but Maya stayed by his side every step of the way, giving him the love, the encouragement, and the strength to keep moving forward. They both had a long road ahead, but Maya knew that as long as they faced it together, they could get through anything. No matter how much time it took, they would get there. The weeks continued to drag by, and with each passing day, Zane's progress was both hopeful and frustrating. His physical strength was returning slowly, and he was able to sit up for longer periods, take a few steps with assistance, and even grasp a basketball in his hand again, though it still felt strange, almost foreign to him. There were moments when Maya caught him staring at the ball with a mixture of longing and fear. He wanted to play again so badly, but his body wouldn't let him. Not yet, but despite the setbacks, there were also small victories that kept their spirits afloat. Zane began to remember more about his life before the accident, the things that made him laugh, the simple joy of playing with his friends, riding his bike, and the world that now seemed just out of reach. His memory had come back in fragments, and every time he remembered something new, Maya felt like a piece of her heart healed, even if just a little. One evening, after a particularly long therapy session, Zane was sitting in his room, flipping through an old photo album Maya had brought for him. He stopped on a picture of them together. Zane as a little boy, laughing in the park, his face covered in ice cream. Maya felt a smile tug at her lips as she watched him, but then Zane's voice cut through the quiet. Mom, I don't remember much, but I remember that day. He pointed to the picture of them, his fingers brushing over the image of his younger self. I remember how happy I was. I want to feel like that again. Maya sat beside him, her heart aching as she nodded. She had never wanted anything more than for Zane to feel whole again, to see that joy return to his face, the carefree spirit that had defined him. You will, sweetheart. You will get back to that. It's just going to take time. She squeezed his hand, doing her best to reassure him, even if she, too, wasn't sure what the future would look like. She didn't want to tell him the truth, how uncertain everything was, how recovery wasn't always linear. Some days he would be better, other days worse, but she wouldn't let him see her doubts. Not now. I feel like I'm forgetting so many things. What if I can't get them back? Zane's voice was small, filled with fear that Maya had seen before, but had never been able to fix. The fear of losing himself, of never being able to return to who he once was. Maya took a deep breath, fighting back the lump in her throat. She understood. She understood the fear of what he might lose, but she also knew that Zane was stronger than he realized. Zane, you don't have to remember everything right away. It's okay to take it slow. You're doing great. You're already so much stronger than you think. She brushed a strand of hair from his face, smiling softly. We'll do this together. You're not alone in this. Zane's eyes softened as he looked at her, and for the first time in weeks, she saw a glimmer of the old him, the boy who never gave up. His lip trembled, but he nodded, swallowing the fear that had taken root inside of him. I'm trying, Mom. I really am. I don't want you to be disappointed. Maya shook her head gently, brushing her hand over his. You could never disappoint me, Zane. I'm so proud of you. And that night, for the first time since the accident, Maya allowed herself to truly believe in the possibility of Zane's recovery. There were no guarantees, no promises that things would go back to the way they were. But the small, bright sparks of hope she had seen in him, that was what kept her going. And as long as Zane kept fighting, she would too. The months passed, and with each day, Zane's progress continued to unfold in ways that felt almost miraculous. It wasn't always smooth. There were setbacks, days when he struggled with the simplest tasks, when the frustration of his slow recovery would cloud his spirit. But there were also breakthroughs, small but powerful. The first time he had run across the yard without falling. The first time he was able to remember and recite one of his favorite songs without hesitation. And the first time he held a basketball again, this time not just gripping it with longing, but playing, throwing it toward the hoop with more confidence than Maya had seen in weeks. Zane's recovery wasn't linear. It was messy, unpredictable, and often slow. But Maya realized it was also real. Every challenge, every small victory, was a part of their journey together. They had learned to celebrate the small steps, the fleeting moments of joy, because they were the milestones that led to something bigger. One warm afternoon, as Zane sat on the porch, his feet dangling from the edge, Maya came outside with a glass of lemonade. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over everything, and for the first time in what felt like forever, everything felt calm, normal almost. "Mom, do you think I'll ever be able to play sports again, like I used to?" Zane asked, his voice full of the uncertainty that still clung to him. Even after all the progress, the question was still there, lingering between them like an unspoken fear. Maya sat down beside him, her heart aching at the question, but at the same time proud of how far he'd come. "Zane, I think you will." She said it slowly, carefully. "Maybe not exactly the same way you did before, but you'll find a way to make it your own. You've already shown me how strong you are. There's nothing you can't do if you set your mind to it." Zane looked up at her, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. He wasn't the same boy who had gone to bed that night a month ago, unsure of his future. This Zane had learned to face uncertainty with courage, even if he didn't have all the answers. "Thanks, Mom." His voice was soft, but the sincerity in it made Maya's heart swell. He was stronger than he gave himself credit for. Maya wrapped her arm around him, pulling him close. She didn't have all the answers either, but in that moment, she knew that they had both come so far. They had learned to face the unknown together, and that was enough. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Zane continued to heal, not just physically but emotionally. Slowly, the pieces of his old self began to return. The spark in his eyes grew brighter, his laughter returned with more ease, and the joy of life that had once felt out of reach was now back in full force. Maya watched him with a heart full of gratitude, no longer focused on the before or the after. She knew this was their new beginning, and she was determined to make it count. Zane wasn't the same as he had been before the accident, but he was still Zane, full of strength, full of life. And in that, Maya saw a future for them both, one filled with hope, with challenges to overcome, and with the understanding that no matter how hard life got, they had each other. With the basketball sitting beside them on the porch, Zane turned to Maya and smiled, his eyes filled with that same spark from before. "I think I'm ready to try again." Maya smiled back, knowing that they had already overcome the hardest part. And whatever came next, they would face it together.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.